actually, I'll tell you something. The point you just raised with me has not been raised by anybody else. With me, any other international leader, let alone the leader of a recipient country, and because they know that the UK is one of the biggest donors in the world, and they know that in spite of the global pandemic, in spite of having to spend £407 billion supporting jobs and families and livelihoods in this country, we're spending £10 billion supporting the poorest and neediest around the world. And I think people understand that, you know, we're still the second biggest aid contributor in the G7, and I think people can be very, very proud of it. Okay, look, I know, have I exhausted your questions? I have. Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and the host of the G7, taking questions from UK reporters and an American reporter, an Italian reporter, answering a lot of questions. We are now expecting to hear from President Biden. He has taken a helicopter from the site of the G7 to a nearby airport, where he will take some questions before he jets off to go meet with the Queen. Back with me now is the president of the Eurasia Group, Ian Bremmer. He's also the president and founder of G0 Media and the host of G0 World on PBS. Hagar Shamali is with me as well. She's the former spokesperson for the U.S. mission to the United Nations and for terrorism and financial intelligence at the Treasury Department. Always entertaining to watch Boris Johnson. There was a question from an American reporter comparing him to Donald Trump, and the reporter even compared him physically to Donald Trump. But in fact, they're very different creatures. This back and forth that you see is common to parliamentary democracies, where there's a lot of back and forth with each other and with the media. But what caught your attention out of everything he said substantively? There was a lot of UK reporters talking about COVID restrictions in the UK, but beyond that, what do you think?
First of all, I was thoroughly entertained because I thought their press conferences were much more interesting than ours. I really enjoyed his focus on girls' education personally. I love seeing a British Prime Minister focus on that. But I want to harp in quickly on the point about comparing him and Trump a little bit, because when I was in government, the United Kingdom was one of the most important allies, and there are a lot of important ones. I'm not trying to rank them, but there was a closeness there, and it wasn't based on the ideologies of the leaders. It was really based on history, and it was based on shared values. And so I actually really do feel for Prime Minister Boris Johnson, though he really did make an effort, and maybe it was too much of an effort. Maybe from a PR standpoint, it may have not helped him to cozy up so closely to President Trump, former President Trump. But what he's trying to do is just perpetuate a long-standing relationship. That really doesn't surprise me. I would have done the same thing. Frankly, I would have advised him the same way. And I do think he's showing a little leg there when he says that President Biden is a big breath of fresh air.
Okay, that's a horrible visual. Johnson's showing a bit of leg, but let's get beyond that. Boris Johnson is in the strongest domestic political position of any person on that stage. And that is very, very unusual given what he has gone through. It's because of the jabs and to be able to roll that out after an abysmal, a shambolic initial response. And it's because the economic response is more robust, plus he and the labor leaders a disaster. The UK's international position is, as we just heard, horrible. The UK relationship with the EU, you got some questions on that?
Yep.
Deeply problematic. With Macron, with the Germans, with the head of the EU, the fight over Northern Ireland and the hard border potential with the Republic of Ireland, a part of the EU. The fact that the UK itself might even have referenda down the road for Scottish independence. This country may not be a country in 10 years' time. That's not true of any other G7. The US relationship with the UK, it's good, but it's not as important as it used to be,
right?
Because they're not our ally inside Europe. And the fact that he came out and said, actually, the bug didn't come from a lab, when the United States is actually engaged in investigation. Why did he say that? Because he needs the Chinese. Why does he need the Chinese? Because he doesn't have anybody. Right? I mean, they're not even starting effectively a trade deal with the United States right now, and they've got real problems with the Europeans. So the UK, from a global perspective, is in serious trouble right now.
Hagar, your point about ideology is really important, because if you look at that G7, they're not all ideologically aligned. There's something that when you take Donald Trump out of the equation seems to make people understand historically that they have to have alliances that aren't around ideology. And you're right, the UK and the US, I come from Canada. The Canadian-U.S. relationship has been good, notwithstanding what party the leaders are from. Is there some? You read this communique, or at least the executive summary of it. Is there anything in here that matters, or does it just matter that they had a communique and they generally left all smiling with each other?
No, this is a strong communique from what we've seen. Ian and I were talking about it earlier, actually. You know, you start off with it, and the COVID stuff is obvious. The climate stuff seems obvious. You start to think, okay, this is kind of a general communique where they're just making grand statements of agreement. But they have explicit language on China, which is a big deal.
China wasn't even mentioned, in fact, for the last few G7s.
Not only that, but right, and they didn't really prep us on the fact that they were going to include China. That's a little bit of a surprise here, and they hone in, you know, on human rights abuse, which I really am excited about personally, and to highlight as well to Greg what's going on in Ethiopia. This is a significant problem. Not a lot of people are talking about it. To highlight that is to show, and right, if the world's most advanced economies don't show leadership on these issues, then nobody's going to care.
Right.
And Ethiopia knows that, right? So they're listening to what these G7 leaders are saying. So the fact that they mentioned that, and the fact that they mentioned ransomware attacks, I know personally I'm very interested in this. Having worked on the kidnapping for ransom issues, I see a lot of similarities, right? Ransomware insurance has gone up. As a result, ransomware attacks have gone up because the attackers are getting paid. It's a big problem, and it needs to be addressed in a coordinated fashion. And they seem to have highlighted that they intend to do that.
I mean, compare this communique to what's going to come out of the Putin meeting with Biden. This is vastly more substantive. This is an A-, and there is coordination on climate. It is moving in a better direction. There's some momentum. There's real movement in response to COVID.
We can't overstate that, right? Here in America, as you pointed out a little while ago, it's in the rearview mirror for us. There have been more COVID deaths in 2021 this year than in all of last year.
That's right. Yeah.
So in fact, on a global scale, this thing is very much in front of us.
The Europeans are almost where we are right now. The Canadians are almost where we are right now. But the developing world, leaving aside China, the developing world are in the thick of it, and they desperately need our help. And the G7, for the first time, is actually showing that they're going to be a part of the solution. It's not enough. It's not fast enough. It's not big enough. But it's meaningful.
But it may mean that the next time we have a pandemic, and all the people say we will, we can have something that feels like a coordinated global response, because we didn't have that.
No,
this
we
time.
can't. We can see maybe more of a coordinated response among the G7. That ain't global. The fact that this started in China and the U.S.-China relationship is vastly worse as a consequence of that the rest of the world doesn't trust that the Chinese are being transparent. Increasingly, we barely trust even the Chinese vaccine. There is nothing global about this response. This is a response of 7 democracies. Let's be very clear. The world's soon-to-be largest economy is China. That is so far from what global could possibly be. We've got a problem on that.
So, Hagar, it's late night in Beijing right now. What do they think about this? The mention of China. What do they think that China is actually something that the G7 thinks it needs to confront?
Well, if there's anything we've seen with China, it's that if somebody punches at them, they punch back, right? They're not going to see this and feel threatened by it, or even if they
really,
do.
in fairness to China, their punch was first, right? If they're talking about building back better for the world, it's because we're reacting to something that China has done, going out into the developing world and saying, we'll build your stuff and we'll pay for your stuff.
Right. Oh no, completely. If anything, I mean, and Ian alludes to this. First of all, I completely agree on China. The threat that they do pose, given how large an economy they are, how difficult they've been in allowing a transparent investigation based on evidence as to the origins of the virus, it poses a significant problem for a future pandemic, of which there will certainly be. And having 7 democracies come out with this statement is a start in pushing back against China, but they're not going to change their behavior. If anything, it's only going to get worse. You need a much wider group for that to happen, a much larger group that doesn't just include, like, beyond the G20. I mean, it has to include their neighbors. It has to include their largest trade partners. You know, I don't want to be unrealistic and say it has to include a country like Russia, for example, but it does, in order to actually twist their arm into cooperating.
I'm sorry. It's useful that China is here. It's better than it's not. The alignment of the United States on China is not at the G7. It's the Quad. It's Japan, it's Australia, it's India, and the United States, as Bobby Ghosh was saying in the last hour. That is where the Americans are mostly engaging with like-minded countries on China. This group largely sees the Chinese as a country they need to hedge with. Italy, for example, not in the G7, but nonetheless an important ally, is a member of Belt and Road. The UK is doing an awful lot of trade with the Chinese. They need it. The Germans engaged much more from industrial policy perspective with the Chinese. On technology policy, not really here, except for on Russia and ransomware, but in working with the Chinese, 5G, all the stuff we've been talking about the US, nothing here. Why not? Because the Europeans are not prepared to just say we're only working with the United States on that. The UK might be, the Canadians might, not the Europeans. Largest trading bloc together in the world, common market. They're working with the Chinese. So it's important to recognize that as much as this was a useful step forward, this is not a united America and all allies dealing with big global problems together.
Hagar, you were involved in the U.S.-led negotiations to come to a deal with Iran. Donald Trump pulled out of that. It seems that there have been some overtures in the last couple of weeks. The United Nations has, the U.S. has lifted some sanctions on some Iranians, maybe a bit of an olive branch to say if you play by the rules, we can go back to the table on this discussion. Meanwhile, the Iranians are talking to the Russians about military hardware. Is that going to come up with Biden and Putin to say we need to deal with Iran when it comes to nuclear proliferation? We need to deal with them when it comes to Iran. Maybe with Syria, if anybody's still interested in that topic. So while he's got to push back on Putin and tell him that he's not Trump, he does have to get some things out of Putin.
He does. I don't personally see Iran as one of the number one issues on their agenda, right? And there are a number of reasons for that. And the delistings that you're talking about, by the way, I wouldn't read too much into them.
Okay.
And the reason for that is that Treasury made zero statement related to it, and it was in order to convey, right? There's nothing there at this point in time.
They just took people off the list, basically.
They did, and delistings can be very routine. Now, I know for Iran they're not common.
Yeah.
But the fact that they tried to do it, they kind of hid it a little bit. They didn't have a press release or a statement really prepared for it. It was meant to convey, like, you know, there are some reasons there that we don't know of, and it may be part of an olive branch.
But don't worry about it. Don't think too much into it.
It doesn't mean that we're near anything, near any kind of negotiation or deal at this point in time. But with Putin, President Biden on Friday said that he has things he wants to let him know, right? And he was a little tough guy about it. And personally, I really enjoyed watching that. But I think that that means that this meeting is going to allow Biden to talk about all the type of nefarious behavior that he is not going to tolerate. And I thought the trip, it's extremely strategic to start with the G7, then go to the NATO summit and walk into the meeting with Switzerland. Now, I am not expecting Putin to bow down or to change his behavior drastically, but it is at least a first step after the last 4 years in communicating to Putin. This is what we're not going to stand for. We're not going to stand for your meddling in elections. We're not going to stand for the ransomware attacks. We're not going to stand for the interference in Ukraine. We're not going to stand for you propping up Assad in Syria, right? And I have all these countries behind me. And Putin probably will laugh a little bit, and it's going to take a lot of time.
Right.
But that communication is so crucial, especially when you're dealing with
Unfortunately, Joe Biden was the vice president of the United States the last time an American told Russia, we're not going to stand for your nonsense, and then Crimea happened. So
And that, yes.
is Putin going to take Joe Biden seriously?
And the red line on Syria, and Obama didn't do anything about that. Trump was the one that actually made that attack. The saying that, you were not going to tolerate this on elections, there was weak sauce, the U.S. didn't respond well. The fact is, Trump was seen as the useful idiot of Putin. Trump wanted to align with Putin. He didn't, because everyone around Trump refused to allow him to do it.
Hold that thought for a second as we're talking about Russia. Andrea Mitchell has just completed an interview with the U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. I'm going to speak to her in just a moment, but here's a bit of what she just had in her discussion.
When it comes to the cyber issues, and in particular ransomware, I don't want to get ahead of the president, but one thing is clear. He is going to make clear that no responsible state can be in the business of harboring criminal enterprises engaged in cyber attacks, including ransomware. That's very much going to be part of the conversation. The purpose of the meeting is for the president to do two things, which he's made very clear already. It's to tell President Putin directly that we would like a more stable, predictable relationship with Russia, and in that context, there may be an ability to work on some issues where we have overlapping interests. But if Russia is going to continue to take reckless or aggressive actions against us or against any of our partners or allies, we'll respond forcefully. I don't think we're going to get a clear and definitive answer from one meeting, but it's the start of testing the proposition of whether Russia also seeks a more stable, predictable relationship or not.
And straight to President Biden at Cornwall Airport.
Keeping this UK-US partnership going and moving smoothly as it is now. We've just wrapped up what has been an extraordinary collaborative and productive meeting in the G7. Everyone at the table understood and understands both the seriousness and the challenges that we are up against and the responsibility of our proud democracies to step up and deliver for the rest of the world. That's what the G7 is all about, and rallying the world's democracies to meet the challenges that the world faces and deliver for our people and for people, quite frankly, everywhere. Ending the pandemic and maintaining robust support for an equitable, inclusive global economic recovery were the top priorities of our nations as we got together. We know we can't achieve one without the other. That is, we have to deal with the pandemic and in order to be able to deal with economic recovery, which as we're doing in the States, but we committed that we're going to do more for the rest of the world as well. The fact is that the U.S. Contribution is the foundation to work out how we're going to deal with the 100 nations that are poor and having trouble finding vaccines and having trouble dealing with reviving their economies if they were in the first place in good shape. And I committed that we would provide a half a billion beyond the 80 million we've already done, 500 million doses of Pfizer vaccine, which we contracted to pay for. In addition, the money we put into the COVID project, which is that COVID is, I know you all know, but a lot of people may not know what COVID is. That is a system whereby they're going to provide funding for states to be able to get access to vaccines on their own as well. But the bottom line is what that generated was a commitment by the rest of our colleagues at the G7 that they would provide another 500 million. So we're going to have 1 billion doses of vaccine. And in our case, that includes sharing more than not just the 1 billion doses overall, but we're going to provide for 200 million of those doses by the end of the year, another 300 million by the first half of next year. And so it was greeted with some enthusiasm, and we've agreed to work together so that the world is better prepared to detect and deal with future pandemics, because there will be future pandemics. We have I'm sure you've seen it. If you haven't, you'll get it, a joint statement we put out of the G7. You've seen it, I'm sure. And we are committed to follow on to do some significant work, including not only how we deal with the distribution and help in getting shots in arms for the rest of the world, but how we're going to deal with putting together a mechanism to anticipate and deal with and be aware of the next pandemic when it comes along, and there will be others. And we also agreed to take important steps. We're going to support global economic recovery by laying the foundation for an equitable global economy. Critically, the G7 leaders endorsed a global minimum tax of 15%. Too many corporations have been engaged in what are essentially tax havens, deciding that they would pay considerably less in other environs around the world. But this is going to make sure there's a minimum tax, and I'm going to move on this at home as well. Minimum tax for corporations to pay for the profits they make anywhere in the world. And this agreement is going to help arrest the race to the bottom that's been going on among nations attracting corporate investment at the expense of priorities like protecting our workers and investing in infrastructure. We also made a momentous commitment at the G7 to help meet more than $40 trillion need that exists for infrastructure in the developing world. I put forward an idea that was called, we named the Build Back Better World Partnership, which is, we're calling it the B3W. The point is that what's happening is that China has its Belt and Road Initiative, and we think that there's a much more equitable way to provide for the needs of countries around the world. And so it's a values-driven, high-standard, transparent financing mechanism we're going to provide and support projects in 4 key areas: climate, health, digital technology, and gender equity. And we believe that will not only be good for the countries, but be good for the entire world and represent values that our democracies represent, and not autocratic lack of values. By harassing the full potential of those who are harassing, we're going to have to change things. That's the whole idea. But here's the deal. We're going to make sure that we're able to pull together the ability to use the development financing institutions and other development tools to expect a bold new infrastructure investment in low and middle income countries over the coming years, much of it coming from the private sector, which will generate, the capital put in will generate significantly more capital from the private sector. We also made a historic commitment to permanently eliminate the use of our public finance to support unabated coal projects around the world, and to end them by this year. The G7 agreed to that, and those who are not members but visiting members who are participating in the G7 who have coal-fired facilities have also agreed that they would work in that direction as well. So transitioning the world to cleaner energy sources is urgent, it's essential. If we're going to beat the climate, and there is, one of the things some of my colleagues said to me when I was there was, well, the United States' leadership recognizes there is global warming. And I know that sounds silly, but we had a president who basically said it's not a problem, global warming. It is the existential problem facing humanity, and it's being treated that way. So we're going to provide up to $2 billion to support developing countries as they transition away from unabated coal-fired power.
I want to weigh in on what they're talking about here a little bit. First of all, I think Joe Biden is doing a wonderful job in representing the American people. I made reference to the fact of the Saudis, that they needed nothing from us, based around not hate, but based around the fact that they're supposedly got all these deep pockets. Why can't they pay for their own vaccines and let us focus in on the undeveloped countries that cannot afford the vaccines right now? That way it'll be equally distributed amongst all the nations. That was the point that I was trying to make whenever I said to hell with our adversaries are those that have wanted to kill us or take us out. I'm so proud that we have finally done a 180 in acknowledging that yes, the greenhouse environmental changes pertaining to the upper level of the atmosphere is now affecting the lower atmosphere. And until we can do something to reverse this, it's only going to drastically get worse. And that's one of the reasons why Christ said to flee into the mountains, because all these low-lying coastal areas and all these little islands and stuff are going to be very, very vulnerable in the next 10 years towards wreaking the wrath of Mother Nature, that some people say, well, it's of God, some people say it's of the devil, and some people say it's of man. I believe it could possibly be all three, but I also believe this, that God has lifted his umbrella of protection off of us to the point of either sink or swim, and now we're trying to swim back up to the top pertaining to what has happened here, not just with the environment pertaining to global warming, but also with the pandemic and other matters that we see as being threatening to our societies. And there's no doubt the way that China has been playing pertaining to them dominating and cornering the markets is a threat to the world economies. There's no doubt that Russia and what has been going on over in Russia pertaining to the malware, the ransomware, the hacking, there's no doubt that this is a threat not only to the American people, but to the world, pertaining to bad actors that thinks that they can tip-tap around on the computer because they got a little more sense than we do, possibly, and they're intervening by causing havoc to either businesses or even governments, cities, whatever, asking for ransom, basically holding that industry or that town, holding them at ransom. This should be looked upon as a terrorism type act, regardless whether it's coming from Russia or it's coming from the innermost domestic areas here in America or anywhere in the world. It should be looked upon as being nothing more than a terrorist attack upon to our industries, because it can affect our dollar, our bottom line pertaining to our dollar, and it not only can affect our dollar, but it can also affect human lives. Once more, I give this man here 2 thumbs up in not only recognizing that the rest of the undeveloped world needs some sort of a upper hand pertaining to the COVID crisis, the pandemic, and I also give this man 2 thumbs up towards pursuing and engulfing in the fact that yes, America has now realized that global warming, environmentally changes, is in fact true. It is no longer considered a theory once science can prove through patterns that it's not a coincidence. Once you can establish a pattern pertaining to year after year after year towards the world getting warmer and warmer and warmer, then it's no longer considered a theory. Now it's considered a fact. We know this. We have observed this and been observing this for quite some time. Now it is intensifying. Let's listen to a little bit more of this once more. Good luck to all of us coming from the Windmill Ministries. And yes, as we end our broadcast, we want to say shalom to our people. God bless America, and God bless those who are pursuing democracy in a most foremost fair way across our great land.
In addition, we also agreed to tackle corruption, which is a threat to societies everywhere. I pointed out in the conversation I had with one of the leaders actually with China, it was a request for me not to try to. When I was asked what I was going to be doing after being elected, I said we're going to reestablish the strength of American relationships so we can be counted on again, alliances. And suggested that, well, maybe you shouldn't get the Quad, meaning India, Japan, Australia, and the United States working together. And maybe you shouldn't be pushing on strengthening the European Union to deal with the West, not just to have, and so on. And I said, for an American president to, every president to be sustained, or prime minister, has to represent the values of their country. And I pointed out, and I mean it sincerely, we're unique as a country. We're unique in the sense that we're not based on ethnicity or geography or religion. We're one nation that said we organized on an idea. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. Sounds corny, but it's real. And any president who doesn't act consistent with what the raison d'etat for the nation is cannot be sustained at the support of that country. And so what we were able to do is, we know that corruption undermines the trust in government, siphons off public resources, makes economies much less competitive, and constitutes a threat to our security. So we're going to work together to address issues like the abuse of shell companies, money laundering through real estate transactions, and we've agreed that we're going to work together to address cyber threats from state and non-state actors like criminal ransomware networks, and hold countries accountable that harbor criminal ransomware actors, don't hold them accountable. And over the past few weeks, the nations of the G7 have affirmed that democratic values that underpin everything we hope to achieve in our shared future, that we're committed to put them to work. 1, delivering vaccines and ending the pandemic. 2, driving substantial inclusive economic recovery around the world. 3, in fueling infrastructure development in places that most badly need it. And 4, in fighting climate change. The only way we're going to meet the global threats is by working together and with our partners and our allies. And I conveyed to each of my G7 counterparts that the United States is going to do our part. America is back at the table. America is back at the table. The lack of participation in the past and full engagement was noticed significantly, not only by the leaders of those countries, but by the people in the G7 countries. And America's back in the business of leading the world alongside nations who share our most deeply held values. And so the bottom line is I was very pleased with the outcome of the entire conference. I noticed there was a lot of coverage of my individual comments made by my colleagues about how we were all getting along together. But the truth of the matter is we did. I felt, and it wasn't about me, but it was about America, I felt a genuine sense of enthusiasm that America was back at the table and fully engaged. And now I'm going to be heading off to Brussels, to NATO, and many of the same people are going to be at that table and in NATO, and to make the case we are back as well. We do not view NATO as a sort of a protection racket. We believe that NATO is vital to our ability to maintain American security for the remainder of the century. And there's a real enthusiasm. I made it clear, and I pointed out, and I thanked them. Article 5 is an attack on one is attack on all. Well, what Americans sometimes don't forget, remember what happened on 9/11. We were attacked. Immediately, NATO supported us. NATO supported us. NATO went till we got bin Laden. NATO was part of the process. And I want them to know, unlike whether they doubt it, that we believe NATO and Section 5 is a sacred obligation. Bottom line is, I think we've made some progress in reestablishing American credibility among our closest friends and our values. Now, why don't I take some of your questions? And I'm told, Jonathan, I'm supposed to talk, recognize you first.
Well, I appreciate that, sir. Thank you very much.
That'll be the end of this particular session with President Joe Biden discussing things that he has done and things that he is going to do. Like I said a while ago, we here at the Windmill Ministries gives him 2 thumbs up. Thanks again, and shalom.